Chapter 19 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 19. An Interlude. To think that this is my 20th birthday, and that I've left my teens behind me forever, said Anne, who was curled up on the hearthrug with Rusty in her lap, to Aunt Jamesina, who was reading in her pet chair. They were alone in the living room. Stella and Priscilla had gone to a committee meeting, and Phil was upstairs adorning herself for a party.
"I suppose you feel kind of sorry,"
said Aunt Jamesina.
"The teens are such a nice part of life. I'm glad I've never gone out of them myself."
Anne laughed. "You never will, Auntie. You'll be 18 when you should be 100. Yes, I'm sorry, and a little dissatisfied as well. Miss Stacy told me long ago that by the time I was 20 my character would be formed for good or evil. I don't feel that it's what it should be. It's full of flaws."
"So's everybody's,"
said Aunt Jamesina cheerfully.
"Mine's cracked in 100 places. Your Miss Stacy likely meant that when you are 20 your character would have got its permanent bent in one direction or t'other, and would go on developing in that line. Don't worry over it, Dan. Do your duty by God and your neighbor and yourself, and have a good time. That's my philosophy, and it's always worked pretty well. Where's Phil off to tonight?"
"She's going to a dance, and she's got the sweetest dress for it. Creamy yellow silk and cobwebby lace. It just suits those brown tints of hers."
"There's magic in the words silk and lace, isn't there?"
said Aunt Jamesina.
"The very sound of them makes me feel like skipping off to a dance. And yellow silk, it makes one think of a dress of sunshine. I always wanted a yellow silk dress, but first my mother and then my husband wouldn't hear of it. The very first thing I'm going to do when I get to heaven is to get a yellow silk dress."
Amid Anne's peal of laughter Phil came downstairs, trailing clouds of glory, and surveyed herself in the long oval mirror on the wall.
"A flattering looking-glass is a promoter of amiability,"
she said.
"The one in my room does certainly make me green. Do I look pretty nice, Anne?"
"Do you really know how pretty you are, Phil?" asked Anne, in honest admiration.
"Of course I do. What are looking-glasses and men for? That wasn't what I meant. Are all my ends tucked in? Is my skirt straight? And would this rose look better lower down? I'm afraid it's too high. It will make me look lopsided. But I hate things tickling my ears."
"Everything is just right, and that southwest dimple of yours is lovely."
"Anne, there's one thing in particular I like about you. You're so ungrudging. There isn't a particle of envy in you."
"Why should she be envious?"
demanded Aunt Jamesina.
"She's not quite as good-looking as you, maybe, but she's got a far handsomer nose."
"I know it,"
conceded Phil. "My nose always has been a great comfort to me," confessed Anne.
"And I love the way your hair grows on your forehead, Anne. And that one wee curl, always looking as if it were going to drop, but never dropping, is delicious. But as for noses, mine is a dreadful worry to me. I know by the time I'm 40 it will be Bernie. What do you think I'll look like when I'm 40, Anne?"
"Like an old matronly married woman," teased Anne.
"I won't,"
said Phil, sitting down comfortably to wait for her escort.
"Joseph, you calico beastie, don't you dare jump on my lap. I won't go to a dance all over cat hairs. No, Anne, I won't look matronly. But no doubt I'll be married."
"To Alec or Alonzo?" asked Anne.
"To one of them, I suppose,"
sighed Phil.
"if I can ever decide which."
"It shouldn't be hard to decide,"
scolded Aunt Jamesina.
"I was born a seesaw, Auntie, and nothing can ever prevent me from teetering."
"You ought to be more level-headed, Philippa."
"It's best to be level-headed, of course,"
agreed Philippa.
"but you miss lots of fun. As for Alec and Alonzo, if you knew them, you'd understand why it's difficult to choose between them. They're equally nice."
"Then Take somebody who is nicer.
suggested Aunt Jamesina.
There's that senior who is so devoted to you, Will Leslie. He has such nice, large, mild eyes.
They're a bit too large and too mild, like a cow's,
said Phil cruelly.
What do you say about George Parker?
There's nothing to say about him, except that he always looks as if he had just been starched and ironed.
Mar Holworthy, then? You can't find a fault with him.
No, he would do if he wasn't poor. I must marry a rich man, Aunt Jamesina. That, and good looks, is an indispensable qualification. I'd marry Gilbert Blythe if he were rich.
Oh, would you? Said Anne, rather viciously.
We don't like that idea a little bit, although we don't want Gilbert ourselves, oh no,
mocked Phil.
But don't let's talk of disagreeable subjects. I'll have to marry sometime, I suppose, but I shall put off the evil day as long as I can.
You mustn't marry anybody you don't love, Phil, when all's said and done,
said Aunt Jamesina.
Oh, hearts that loved in the good old way have been out of the fashion this many a day,
trilled Phil mockingly.
There's the carriage. I fly. Bye-bye, you two old-fashioned darlings.
When Phil had gone, Aunt Jamesina looked solemnly at Anne.
That girl is pretty and sweet and good-hearted. But do you think she is quite right in her mind by spells, Anne?
Oh, I don't think there's anything the matter with Phil's mind, said Anne, hiding a smile. It's just her way of talking. Aunt Jamesina shook her head.
Well, I hope so, Anne. I do hope so, because I love her. But I can't understand her. She beats me. She isn't like any of the girls I ever knew, or any of the girls I was myself.
How many girls were you, Aunt Jimsy?
About half a dozen, my dear.
End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 20. Gilbert Speaks.
This has been a dull, prosy day,
yawned Phil, stretching herself idly on the sofa, having previously dispossessed 2 exceedingly indignant cats. Anne looked up from Pickwick Papers. Now that spring examinations were over, she was treating herself to Dickens. It has been a prosy day for us, she said thoughtfully, but to some people it has been a wonderful day. Someone has been rapturously happy in it. Perhaps a great deed has been done somewhere today, or a great poem written, or a great man born, and some heart has been broken, Phil.
Why did you spoil your pretty thought by tagging that last sentence on, honey?
Grumbled Phil.
I don't like to think of broken hearts, or anything unpleasant.
Do you think you'll be able to shirk unpleasant things all your life, Phil?
Dear me, no. Am I not up against them now? You don't call Alec and Alonzo pleasant things, do you, when they simply plague my life out?
You never take anything seriously, Phil.
Why should I? There are enough folks who do. The world needs people like me, Anne, just to amuse it. It would be a terrible place if everybody were intellectual and serious, and in deep, deadly earnest. My mission is, as Josiah Allen says, to charm and allure. Confess now, hasn't life at Patty's Place been really much brighter and pleasanter this past winter because I've been here to leaven you?
Yes, it has, owned Anne.
And you all love me, even Aunt Jamesina, who thinks I'm stark mad. So why should I try to be different? Oh, dear, I'm so sleepy. I was awake until 1 last night, reading a harrowing ghost story. I read it in bed, and after I had finished it, do you suppose I could get out of bed to put the light out? No! And if Stella had not fortunately come in late, that lamp would have burned good and bright till morning. When I heard Stella, I called her in, explained my predicament, and got her to put out the light. If I had got out myself to do it, I knew something would grab me by the feet when I was getting in again. By the way, Anne, has Aunt Jamesina decided what to do this summer?
Yes, she's going to stay here. I know she's doing it for the sake of those blessed cats, although she says it's too much trouble to open her own house, and she hates visiting.
What are you reading?
Pickwick,
That's a book that always makes me hungry.
said Phil.
There's so much good eating in it. The characters seem always to be reveling on ham and eggs and milk punch. I generally go on a cupboard rummage after reading Pickwick. The mere thought reminds me that I'm starving. Is there any tidbit in the pantry, Queen Anne?
I made a lemon pie this morning. You may have a piece of it. Phil dashed out to the pantry, and Anne betook herself to the orchard in company with Rusty. It was a moist, pleasantly odorous night in early spring. The snow was not quite all gone from the park. A little dingy bank of it yet lay under the pines of the harbour road, screened from the influence of April suns. It kept the harbour road muddy and chilled the evening air. But grass was growing green in sheltered spots, and Gilbert had found some pale sweet arbutus in a hidden corner. He came up from the park, his hands full of it. Anne was sitting on the big grey boulder in the orchard, looking at the poem of a bare birchen bough hanging against the pale red sunset with the very perfection of grace. She was building a castle in air, a wondrous mansion whose sunlit courts and stately halls were steeped in Araby's perfume, and where she reigned queen and chatelaine. She frowned as she saw Gilbert coming through the orchard. Of late she had managed not to be left alone with Gilbert, but he had caught her fairly now, and even Rusty had deserted her. Gilbert sat down beside her on the boulder and held out his mayflowers.
Do these remind you of home and our old school-day picnics, Anne?
Anne took them and buried her face in them. "I'm in Mr. Silas Sloane's barrens this very minute," she said rapturously.
I suppose you'll be there in reality in a few days.
"No, not for a fortnight. I'm going to visit with Phil in Bolingbroke before I go home. You'll be in Avonlea before I will."
No, I shall not be in Avonlea at all this summer, Anne. I've been offered a job in the Daily News office, and I'm going to take it.
"Oh," said Anne vaguely. She wondered what a whole Avonlea summer would be like without Gilbert. Somehow she did not like the prospect. "Well," she concluded flatly, "it is a good thing for you, of course."
Well, yes, I've been hoping I would get it. It'll help me out next year.
"You mustn't work too hard," said Anne, without any very clear idea of what she was saying. She wished desperately that Phil would come out. "You've studied very constantly this winter. Isn't this a delightful evening? Do you know I found a cluster of white violets under that old twisted tree over there today? I felt as if I had discovered a gold mine."
You're always discovering gold mines,
said Gilbert, also absently. "Let us go and see if we can find some more," suggested Anne eagerly. "I'll call Phil and—"
Never mind Phil and the violets just now, Anne,
said Gilbert quietly, taking her hand in a clasp from which she could not free it.
There's something I want to say to you.
"Oh, don't say it," cried Anne pleadingly. "Don't. Please, Gilbert."
I must. Things can't go on like this any longer, Anne. I love you. You know I do. I can't tell you how much. Will you promise me that someday you'll be my wife?
I can't," said Anne miserably. "Oh, Gilbert, you've spoiled everything."
Don't you care for me at all?
Gilbert asked after a very dreadful pause, during which Anne had not dared to look up. Not in that way. I do care a great deal for you as a friend, but I don't love you, Gilbert."
But can't you give me some hope that you will? Yet?
"No, I can't," exclaimed Anne desperately. "I never can love you in that way, Gilbert. You must never speak of this to me again." There was another pause, so long and so dreadful that Anne was driven at last to look up. Gilbert's face was white to the lips, and his eyes, but Anne shuddered and looked away. There was nothing romantic about this. Must proposals be either grotesque or horrible? Could she ever forget Gilbert's face?
Is there anybody else?
He asked at last in a low voice. "No, no," said Anne eagerly. "I don't care for anyone like that. And I like you better than anybody else in the world, Gilbert. And we must go on being friends, Gilbert." Gilbert gave a bitter little laugh.
Friends! Your friendship can't satisfy me, Anne. I want your love. And you tell me I can never have that.
I'm sorry. Forgive me, Gilbert, was all Anne could say. Where, oh, where were all the gracious and graceful speeches wherewith, in imagination, she had been wont to dismiss rejected suitors? Gilbert released her hand gently.
There isn't anything to forgive. There have been times when I thought you did care. I've deceived myself, that's all. Goodbye, Anne.
Anne got herself to her room, sat down on her window-seat behind the pines, and cried bitterly. She felt as if something incalculably precious had gone out of her life. It was Gilbert's friendship, of course. Oh, why must she lose it after this fashion?
What is the matter, honey?
Asked Phil, coming in through the moonlit gloom. Anne did not answer. At that moment she wished Phil were 1,000 miles away.
I suppose you've gone and refused Gilbert Blythe. You are an idiot, Anne Shirley.
Do you call it idiotic to refuse to marry a man I don't love? Said Anne coldly, goaded to reply.
You don't know love when you see it. You've tricked something out with your imagination that you think love, and you expect the real thing to look like that. There, that's the first sensible thing I've ever said in my life. I wonder how I managed it.
Phil, pleaded Anne, please go away and leave me alone for a little while. My world has tumbled into pieces. I want to reconstruct it.
Without any Gilbert in it?
Said Phil, going. A world without any Gilbert in it. Anne repeated the words drearily. Would it not be a very lonely, forlorn place? Well, it was all Gilbert's fault. He had spoiled their beautiful comradeship. She must just learn to live without it. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 21. Roses of Yesterday. The fortnight Anne spent in Bolingbroke was a very pleasant one, with a little undercurrent of vague pain and dissatisfaction running through it whenever she thought about Gilbert. There was not, however, much time to think about him. Mount Holly, the beautiful old Gordon homestead, was a very gay place, overrun by Phil's friends of both sexes. There was quite a bewildering succession of drives, dances, picnics, and boating parties, all expressively lumped together by Phil under the head of jamborees. Alec and Alonzo were so constantly on hand that Anne wondered if they ever did anything but dance attendance on that will-o'-the-wisp of a Phil. They were both nice, manly fellows, but Anne would not be drawn into any opinion as to which was the nicer.
And I depended so on you to help me make up my mind which of them I should promise to marry,
mourned Phil. You must do that for yourself. You are quite expert at making up your mind as to whom other people should marry, retorted Anne, rather caustically.
Oh, that's a very different thing,
said Phil truly. But the sweetest incident of Anne's sojourn in Bolingbroke was the visit to her birthplace, the little shabby yellow house in an out-of-the-way street she had so often dreamed about. She looked at it with delighted eyes as she and Phil turned in at the gate. "It's almost exactly as I've pictured it," she said. "There is no honeysuckle over the windows, but there is a lilac tree by the gate, and, yes, there are the muslin curtains in the windows. How glad I am it is still painted yellow." A very tall, very thin woman opened the door.
"Yes, the Shirleys lived here 20 years ago,"
she said, in answer to Anne's question.
"They had it rented. I remember 'em. They both died of fever at once. It was terrible sad. They left a baby. I guess it's dead long ago. It was a sickly thing. Old Thomas and his wife took it, as if they hadn't enough of their own."
"It didn't die," said Anne, smiling. "I was that baby."
"You don't say so! Why, you have grown,"
exclaimed the woman, as if she were much surprised that Anne was not still a baby.
"Come to look at you, I see the resemblance. You're complected like your pa. He had red hair. But you favor your ma in your eyes and mouth. She was a nice little thing. My darter went to school to her and was nigh crazy about her. They was buried in the one grave, and the school board put up a tombstone to them as a reward for faithful service. Will you come in?"
"Will you let me go all over the house?" asked Anne eagerly.
"Laws, yes, you can if you like. 'Twon't take you long. There ain't much of it. I'll keep in my mind to build a new kitchen, but he ain't one of your hustlers. The parlor's in there, and there's 2 rooms upstairs. Just prowl about yourselves. I've got to see the baby. The east room was the one you were born in. I remember your ma saying she loved to see the sun rise, and I mind hearing that you was born just as the sun was rising, and its light on your face was the first thing your ma saw."
Anne went up the narrow stairs and into that little east room with a full heart. It was as a shrine to her. Here her mother had dreamed the exquisite happy dreams of anticipated motherhood. Here that red sunrise light had fallen over them both in the sacred hour of birth. Here her mother had died. Anne looked about her reverently, her eyes filled with tears. It was for her one of the jeweled hours of life that gleam out radiantly forever in memory. "Just to think of it, Mother was younger than I am now when I was born," she whispered. When Anne went downstairs, the lady of the house met her in the hall. She held out a dusty little packet tied with faded blue ribbon.
"Here's a bundle of old letters I found in that closet upstairs when I came here," she said. "I don't know what they are. I never bothered to look in 'em. But the address on the top one is Miss Bertha Willis, and that was your ma's maiden name. You can take 'em if you'd keer to have 'em."
"Oh, thank you, thank you," cried Anne, clasping the packet rapturously.
"That was all that was in the house,"
said her hostess.
"The furniture was all sold to pay the doctor bills, and Mrs. Thomas got your ma's clothes and little things. I reckon they didn't last long among that drove of Thomas youngsters. They was destructive young animals, as I mind 'em."
"I haven't one thing that belonged to my mother," said Anne chokily. I can never thank you enough for these letters."
"You're quite welcome. Laws, but your eyes is like your ma's. She could just about talk with hers. Your father was sort of homely, but awful nice. I mind hearing folks say when they was married that there never was 2 people more in love with each other. Poor creatures. They didn't live much longer. But they was awful happy while they was alive, and I s'pose that counts for a good deal."
Anne longed to get home to read her precious letters, but she made one little pilgrimage first. She went alone to the green corner of the old Bolingbroke cemetery where her father and mother were buried, and left on their grave the white flowers she carried. Then she hastened back to Mount Holly, shut herself up in her room, and read the letters. Some were written by her father, some by her mother. There were not many, only a dozen in all, for Walter and Bertha Shirley had not been often separated during their courtship. The letters were yellow and faded and dim, blurred with the touch of passing years. No profound words of wisdom were traced on the stained and wrinkled pages, but only lines of love and trust. The sweetness of forgotten things clung to them, the far-off, fond imaginings of those long-dead lovers. Bertha Shirley had possessed the gift of writing letters which embodied the charming personality of the writer in words and thoughts that retained their beauty and fragrance after the lapse of time. The letters were tender, intimate, sacred. To Anne, the sweetest of all was the one written after her birth to the father on a brief absence. It was full of a proud young mother's accounts of baby, her cleverness, her brightness, her thousand sweetnesses. "I love her best when she is asleep, and better still when she is awake," Bertha Shirley had written in the postscript. Probably it was the last sentence she had ever penned. The end was very near for her. "This has been the most beautiful day of my life," Anne said to Phil that night. "I've found my father and mother. Those letters have made them real to me. I'm not an orphan any longer. I feel as if I had opened a book and found roses of yesterday, sweet and beloved, between its leaves." End of chapter 21.